Please welcome to our Public Health Sciences webinar series. I would like to begin today by acknowledging that Queens is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. As uninvited guests, we are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands, and I welcome all of us to continue our collective work toward preserving and sustaining these lands for future generations in Kingston and across all of Turtle Island. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome a very special speaker, Dr. Chelsey R, whom we are honored to welcome to Queen's University and the Department of Public Health Sciences as a prestigious Principal Development Fund visiting scholar. Dr. Carter is one of the most exciting and creative social scientists working at the intersection of race, racism, and health, and her work broadly engages theory and method across a variety of disciplinary boundaries. Describing herself as a Black feminist anthropologist of medicine, public health, and race, Dr. Carter's research focuses on the ways in which systemic racism in the medical care system impedes the diagnosis of neurodegenerative and other disorders among Black patients, and by extension among members of other marginalized communities. Her important field project among Black ALS patients in St. Louis, Missouri formed the basis for her forthcoming book, tentatively titled Finding the Forgotten: Race, Bias, and Care in the World of ALS, which she will tell us about today. Dr. Carter actually has an amazing educational background. She earned the BA in anthropology at Emory University, followed by the PhD and MPH at Washington University in St. Louis, where I was privileged to serve as a mentor and advisor. Dr. Carter was actually the very first person to complete the combined PhD and MPH program in anthropology at Washington University, and we were very proud of her work for breaking this barrier. Upon completing the PhD, she received a prestigious presidential postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton University before taking her current tenure-track faculty position at Yale. Dr. Carter is currently an assistant professor of public health in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Yale University School of Public Health, with a secondary appointment in the Department of Anthropology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chelsey Carter.
I hooked up. I also have a loud voice and could just yell. Does that help? All right. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Brad. Really excited to be here, minus the cold. It's real cold. So if I was back at home, I would be one of the 25 people on Zoom right now. So thank you to those of you that came to actually brave the cold with me. It's deeply appreciated. And I'm usually giving these talks on Zoom, so it's nice to see real embodied people. So thanks for being here. Also want to thank Ms. Nikki Remillard for all of her logistical support and all of the people that we don't see here right now that open the doors, close the doors, make sure rooms are clean. Thank you to those not here that I want to thank for supporting me being able to share my intellectual labor. I know that Brad just did a land acknowledgement, which I appreciate, but I just want to extend it a little even further. I'm one of those let's give the land back people. So I just want to acknowledge that this is Anishinaabe land and also Haudenosaunee land, but I also want to recognize that acknowledgements are not, in fact, actually enough to the more structural, colonial, and imperial issues that continue to plague Indigenous people here in Canada and worldwide. And I hope that each of you will really consider thoughtfully how we can work individually and collectively in solidarity with Indigenous people and quite literally return land Black. And then I also always like to acknowledge the labor of other Black people who have helped build these buildings and support these buildings both here in Canada and the US. I am the child of two single Black mothers from St. Louis, Missouri. And so I really think really thoughtfully about coalition building between different racial groups.
Uh-oh, you may just have to click on the slide itself.
Gotcha. There we go, wonderful. In the next 30 to 35-ish minutes, I'm going to talk about my work on ALS. ALS stands for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. I have a lisp, so say that 5 times fast and you'll see most of my pain when giving presentations. It also stands for motor neuron disease, usually in Canada and usually in the UK and Europe. So that's another name that also kind of fits the umbrella of ALS-like diseases. It's a progressive and fatal neurodegenerative disease that affects nerve cells in the brain and the spinal cord. And unfortunately, most individuals live between 2 to 5 years after first symptom onset. Today's small talk thinking about like the epidemiological barriers of ALS is just a small kind of little nugget from my larger book project that Dr. Stoner introduced a bit earlier, Finding the Forgotten. But we're really going to talk today about kind of just some 3 different little vignettes of how my work has evolved in this space. So just to give you a quick overview, I'm going to start with an ethnographic story. I'm not sure if you all have had a lot of anthro speakers, and so I'm going to talk by reading my screen at you for a little while, and then I'll come back and make eye contact. But I really want to situate it with an ethnographic story so you can kind of understand the texture, the nuance, the complexity of studying a disease like ALS. And then I'm going to talk about ALS being a white disease and how it shows up in a lot of public and medical literature as a disease that only affects white people, and even more specifically, white males. And so what happens there when people get left out of imaginations of having a particular disease and how that has reverberations into lots of different other areas of science, medicine, public health, et cetera. And then finally, I'm going to put my baby epi brain on with you all and talk about a case control study where we can look at how something that started off with really great, rich, objective data got a bit skewed and told a different story about because of how the authors decided to share their numbers. Sound good? Awesome. All righty, so let's get started. So in January of 2020, I was on my university's med campus carrying vials of blood from an ALS family I had just drawn and ran into my friend Derek. Derek was leaving the main cafeteria and exclaimed, "Chelsey, I was just talking about your work." Puzzled, I stared at him, waiting for an explanation as to why my Black graduate student friend enrolled in a molecular microbiology and microbial pathogenesis doctoral program would be talking about my work on ALS. Remorsefully, Derek began to share that he hadn't seen his, quote, favorite cafeteria cashier, Tamika, since before Christmas, and that our Uncle Tommy had died of ALS. "Chelsey," Derek nearly screamed again. "He died right here at Midway in December. Did you know him?" My friend asked me. "Was he Black?" I asked back. Derek nodded emphatically yes, which made my mind wander even more. I stared back at him very dejectedly because I was angry that I didn't know who the patient was. I began asking Derek a million questions, most of which he didn't have enough information to share. But he did know 3 things. His name was Tommy Moore. He was a Black man from St. Louis, and he had died from ALS. I left the middle of med campus with Derek promising to put me in touch with Tamika and me promising to find out more about Uncle Tommy's story from the ALS clinicians I had worked with for over 2 years for the data collection for my doctoral project. Someone, I thought, had to know Uncle Tommy. I asked each clinic I worked with, the Veterans Administration Clinic, the City ALS Clinic, and the Midway Clinic and Research Lab where I had worked for over 4 years at this time, and no one knew Tommy Moore. I even checked the weekly clinic list that I was in charge of from 2018 to 2020 for the name Tommy Moore, Tom Moore, Thomas Moore, anything more. It could not find one patient that could match that name. How had I missed this Black patient with ALS during data collection for my ethnographic study? I was at every single clinic for over 24 months. Unfortunately, a week later, Tamika answered my question. Uncle Tommy never made it to an ALS clinic anywhere in St. Louis or across the United States. Uncle Tommy was diagnosed with ALS on December 23rd, 2019. During an interview, Tamika shared with me that Uncle Tommy suffered from seizures his entire life, so he went to, quote, monthly, damn near weekly hospital visits, end quote, according to Tamika and her grandmother, Uncle Tommy's primary caregiver. Uncle Tommy also went to see neurologists, internists, and pulmonologists at a local St. Louis hospital system that housed one of the premier ALS clinics in the entire United States. And yet no one ever diagnosed or tested Uncle Tommy for ALS. Emotionally, Tamika shared, quote, actually, my brother started looking up online and he was like, I think Uncle Tommy's got Lou Gehrig's disease. He's getting all the symptoms of Lou Gehrig's disease. But the doctors kept saying, no, it's not that, it's not that. Tamika believes that Uncle Tommy was showing signs of ALS since spring of 2017. His muscles atrophied. He lost over 120 pounds. He was choking on his food whenever he ate, and he completely lost his ability to walk on his own. But the doctors kept telling Uncle Tommy and his family, it's the medication. We just have to change his seizure medication. Uncle Tommy stopped breathing at home one day in December. His sister, Tamika's grandmother, rushed him to the largest and most central ER in St. Louis, Midway Hospital. They kept him for 2 weeks to run tests. And after arduous tests and tireless work by his clinical team, Uncle Tommy was finally diagnosed with ALS on December 23rd, 2019, like I mentioned before. The tragic ending to this story is not that Uncle Tommy died, because as I explained earlier, ALS is a terminal disease. The tragic ending to this story is that 6 days later, December 29th, 2019, Uncle Tommy died from the advanced stages of ALS. I never met Uncle Tommy at one of the 3 ALS clinics because he unfortunately never made it to one. I asked Tamika, why did she think that this happened? And she shared, quote, I heard it's not common in Black people. My heart broke because this should not have happened. My book project, tentatively titled Finding the Forgotten, begins to offer explanations to the mysterious circumstances surrounding Uncle Tommy's death and so many other people that were involved in my study. How did this happen? Why did it take over 2 years for Uncle Tommy to be diagnosed with ALS? Why had Uncle Tommy been to countless medical providers without being offered a diagnosis or even considered for ALS when it was so blatantly obvious to even members of his family who were not clinicians? The easy answer to this question is that the US healthcare system is broken and abysmal. We can talk about that all day long. However, what happened to Uncle Tommy is much deeper than just a broken healthcare system. It's also more than poor physician training, negligence, and a Black patient's purported mistrust of the healthcare system. Though each of these may have played a part in this story, right? Rather, what happened to Uncle Tommy was a convergence of structures and systems. And to understand this, we need to take a step back and consider the condition of ALS as an illness condition within the American medical system and how ALS functions both ideologically and materially as a racialized condition. In that, race becomes emblematic of and constitutive of different categories of being a sick patient with an incurable neurodegenerative condition. Importantly, how those racialized conditions of ALS play out only become intelligible when we look at it multiscalarly, from the macro to the micro, and we understand the various ways that ALS is constituted, erased, negotiated, and or contested in different ways, at different junctures, but particularly in different bodies. And when I say racialized here, I'm not necessarily saying that only in people who are racialized, because all of us are racialized. Even if we're racialized as white, racialized as indigenous, racialized as Black, we're all racialized. But the disease itself is doing something very interesting in morphing people's understandings into a racialization of this disease. So to get at these issues, I kind of have big driving questions for my book project. What are the mechanisms through which knowledge is produced about ALS research and care? And how are those dimensions then racialized? How do Black patients explicitly with ALS engage with different forms of ALS knowledge? And how does this affect diagnostic pathways, treatment therapies, and everyday life living with ALS? So to get at this work, I draw first on Canadian scholar Margaret Lock's work of local biologies as a point of departure, joining it with a Black feminist anthropological approach. And at first I was really thinking about this work as kind of Margaret Lock's work thinks about local biologies. And now I'm extending this work a little further to think about how local biologies, and particularly racialized local biologies, create different forms of racism. So particularly neurological racism, or for short, neuroracism. So I'm thinking about this and how basically Lock's study of menopause in Canada, which is our book in the middle, Encounters with Aging, how in the US, Canada, and Japan, Locke is basically arguing that purportedly universal biomedical processes, in fact, take different biological forms in different cultural contexts, manifesting in what she calls a local biologies. These local biologies then emphasize the particularity and non-universality of biology, such that biology is inexorably entwined with and contingent upon particular cultural settings. This led me to wonder how race and racialized experiences might function in similar ways in terms of their roles in shaping biological processes. Coming at these issues from a different direction, the book at the far end, Race After Technology, sociologist Ruha Benjamin reminds us that racial biases in medicine and technology don't always exist as a cognitive force of intentional or malignant racism, but are rather baked in as components of structures of knowledge, practice, and care. This suggests that many of the negative medical encounters that Black, Brown, or even Indigenous people may experience aren't because of some malignant racism, but are actually racism by design, and that the structures that we live in are actually supporting a racialized agenda because of the histories of both the United States and also of colonialism across a myriad of countries. Bringing these two perspectives together, along with health disparities literature like Weathering, Allostatic Load, also thinking about obstetric racism through Donna Ayin Davis's book, which is Reproductive Injustice, which is the second book to the far side, that helps us see that actually Black US women during childbirth are experiencing deleterious health outcomes, not because of their educational status and also not because of their class status, but solely because of obstetric racism, which reveals to us that racism is actually getting under the skin and has deleterious biological effects on human bodies. So for me to do this study, it started with having to situate this in a particular place. And so as an anthropologist and an ethnographer, I decided to do my work in Missouri. And I offer you this awful map of the United States in case you didn't know where Missouri was, because most people don't. So it's literally the red state in the middle there. And what I really kind of want to point out with both of these maps and the really awful, if I have any GIS people here, I apologize for this terrible map on the far right, but it's really just to make a point. In the city of St. Louis, which kind of sits like at the tip of Missouri as it's kind of into Illinois there. This map here is what it's basically showing is the residential segregation in the city of St. Louis. So quite literally you can see, you can draw a diagonal line down the city, and the gradients of green and dark green are where areas where Black Americans live, and the areas that become dark red and orange, those are areas that are 85% or more where white Americans in St. Louis live. So when we talk about St. Louis, we're not talking about an abstract segregation issue. We're talking about a very stark division that impacts where people work, where they go to school, where they live, obviously, but also where they get healthcare. And so St. Louis is also my hometown, which is a very complicated space, but it is also home to a history of kind of these racialized issues. So for the past 10 years, St. Louis has headlined national news for being starkly racially divided historically and in the present, as evidenced by Mike Brown's murder, Ferguson, if you've heard of the Ferguson uprisings that happened in St. Louis, the Jason Stockley verdict, vestiges of sundown towns, now hyper-segregated municipalities, and very frequent NAACP travel advisories that tell Black and Brown people to not go through the city of St. Louis. These elements of racial strife make St. Louis a particularly rich place to study race and access to healthcare among white and Black patients with ALS. But also St. Louis is very unique from any of the cities actually in the United States, where in this small metropolitan area that houses about 3.5 million people, there are 3 ALS clinics, which is almost unheard of. Most places have maybe 1 ALS clinic, given some of the demographics from that first slide. And so because 2 of them are located at Research One universities, it offers a really rich space for us to be thinking about how are people accessing care, but also how are then researchers studying ALS and then disseminating that to both local settings, but also international settings as we work to find both the cure for ALS, treatments for ALS, but also understand its etiology. The convergence of these different ALS clinics offered me sites for thinking about knowledge making across the greater St. Louis area. And also I was able to explore how these spaces produce and transmit this knowledge. St. Louis really forced me to consider how epistemological, institutional, clinical, and cultural structures that scaffold understandings and experiences really might shape for different conditions for people. So as an ethnographer, I just wanted to show you kind of a snapshot of some of the tools that I use. So I am an ethnographer. So that really means that I want to be with the people that I'm studying. So I really had to do that in my project by first participating in participant observation. So I shadowed people in my study everywhere, to the doctor, to church, at home, to non-ALS doctors, to the grocery store. So really developing these close relationships where I'm not only participating quite literally as a participant, but also observing any of their interactions. I'm also participating in lots of interviews. So I would say amongst my sample, including clinicians of over 50 people, I collected over 150 interviews because at different points I'm asking different questions, going through different interview guides to get kind of the richness of not only their experience with ALS, but also their experience in St. Louis with ALS as well. I did tons of content analysis, mainly of like nonprofit booklets. So what are they sharing about ALS? How are they talking about the racialized experiences of ALS? Epidemiologically, statistically, but also how is that then transferring to the internet? So how are we talking about ALS on social media? How are we talking about ALS in some of these patient forums that individuals are using? And then specifically, I'm really thinking theoretically here by using a Black feminist approach. And so this means that in my study, I was able to interview Black and white patients with ALS, but I really kind of use this Black feminist approach to say, I'm going to start first with Black people because they have been the ones that have been systemically left out of these conversations. And so by starting there, that's going to open up kind of a wider lens to see what are the problems, what are the concerns, what's working well, because we do already know what's working well because of the populations that have been supported through ALS work and ALS research. So taken together, all of these factors kind of offer some of the groundswell of how I've been thinking about this problem, but how I actually started studying it. So to move to the second thing, I really want to talk about the ways in which ALS has been kind of demonstrated as a white disease in public representations of the illness. So in summer of 2014, I would say more than 17 million people uploaded videos on social media of them dumping buckets of ice over their head to raise money for ALS. At this exact same time, on August 9th, 2014, unarmed Black man Mike Brown Jr. was fatally shot 6 times by a white officer in Ferguson, Missouri. Both of these very separate events ignited social media attention that moved each from, I would say, relative obscurity to global prominence in a number of days. However, both of these movements were not without critique. I opened my Facebook one morning. I don't have it anymore, so don't try to find me there. And a friend's post read, "How many buckets of ice would I have to pour over my head to get people to care about Black lives?" I was stunned. I thought to myself, what are you talking about? Black people get ALS. I have been working with the ALS community since I was 14 at this point. So I was quite moved to see the attention paid towards ALS and people dumping buckets of water over their head. But I realized that this moment wasn't the same for everyone. For me, caring about ALS was not in opposition because I had known a few people with ALS, but I realized the significance for this person. As I started researching more and more as a part of my content analysis, I realized that social media communities like Black Twitter, bloggers, and even Black entertainment television, which is a large television network in the United States, began to circulate information to the Black community about ALS. And the following meme on your far right side went viral. And it said, quote, Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, aka Lou Gehrig's disease, this affects most white males over the age of 40. That's y'all on my timeline. What affects the majority of the people on my timeline is the assassinations of our Black boys, the over-sexualizing of our Black girls, and the complete, miseducation of our people to remain oppressed. I challenge you to make a significant change to your households and communities. No ice bucket needed, just some self-respect, love, and pride. Hashtag rise above, hashtag awareness, hashtag trends. Other bloggers also challenged ALS's low prevalence in the Black community and the ice bucket challenge as a deliberate distraction from racial injustice of Ferguson and called it a whitewashing. More recently, in November of 2017, a popular Black online blog called The Shade Room headline, quote, "The man who inspired the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge passes away." And as I scrolled through the comments with my research assistants, we found over 300 comments like, quote, "Can we get a challenge like this for Black diseases?" And quote, "Wow, too bad this doesn't even affect Black people," end quote. I realized then that the viral momentum of both the Ice Bucket Challenge and Ferguson continue to erase people of color with ALS from understandings of the disease. In ALS advocacy, the disease experiences of white people are often foregrounded first, as I've shared. Famously, baseball player from the New York Yankees, Lou Gehrig's name, who's on the far right, serves as the moniker for the disease. The story of Maury Schwartz's experience with the illness is featured in Mitch Albom's New York Times bestseller book, Tuesdays with Maury. And then, of course, astrophysicist Stephen Hawking has become the most famous face associated with ALS since his diagnosis in 1963 and his death a few years ago. Each of these figures renders a story of ALS and whiteness, and one that reached an even broader audience in the 2014 Ice Bucket Challenge. So I want to quickly highlight, given this, so a part of my study was to then really think through what are some of the differences in my two sample groups. So I have this sample group of Black individuals and their family and caregivers with ALS. And I also have this sample of white people with ALS and their experiences with ALS. And so first, what I really wanted to understand was what are the differences? And so some of the most stark differences was diagnosis, late interventions, and experiences of bias and racism. And so Black patients that I came in contact with had significantly longer diagnostic time periods after symptom onset or no diagnosis at all. They received late interventions that require emergency services. So what I'm thinking about here is a person that was a part of my study who went into the hospital for constipation. Constipation can become very common for ALS patients because of the lack of mobility once you're not able to move and walk around as much, but also because of all of the different drug cocktails that you're taking to mask a lot of your symptoms. And so this individual went into a local St. Louis hospital system that did not have an ALS clinic, and he brought his BiPAP along with him. So his BiPAP, he's allowed to wear it 8 to 10 hours a day, even longer for ALS patients sometimes, because oftentimes the first thing that they lose is the ability to breathe on their own. And so he told his doctor this, he was like, hey, not only my neurologist, but also my respiratory doctor said that it was okay for me to have this BiPAP and use it as I will. And she was, his doctor, who was a she, said, no, that's unsuitable. And so he goes back and forth with her, and next thing you know, they remove his BiPAP from the room because they say you're not supposed to be on a BiPAP that long without understanding the intricacies of ALS and why that would be useful for a patient with ALS, and why he winds up now, unfortunately, living in a nursing home because he had to get a full tracheostomy. And so now he's not able to live on his own because the intervention that did allow him to live with his brothers and 2 others kind of was taken from him because of these emergency room conversations he was having with providers. Other individuals also discussed experiencing bias, Black individuals, or explicitly saying that they felt as though their doctors were being racist to them because they were denying them certain procedures, not listening to their concerns, and also not respecting the choices that they were then making for them. And so these were some of the distinctions that I was seeing. Around this time that I'm analyzing my qualitative data to kind of start eliciting and pulling out these themes, I have an interview looking for a new research assistant while I'm in graduate school. And she comes into the interview and she's like, Chelsey, I'm so excited about this interview because I just learned that Black people are now living longer with ALS. And I'm like, huh? Because all my research has told me and showed me that Black people are not even being diagnosed timely with ALS. So how are they now suddenly living longer? So we literally like stop her interview and begin to do like a deep dive. And I'm like, are you serious? Did you really find this heading? And next thing I know, we find all of these headings that basically say Blacks live longer, not necessarily better with ALS. African Americans with ALS live longer. And so all of these news findings bring us finally to the actual article. Racial differences in intervention rates in individuals with ALS, a case control study. And just as she noted, we found these specific headlines, but we really wanted to read this article and see what is it that they were saying that was suggesting that Black patients globally, right? Because this one paper is now making a statement that is getting pushed out by health communication journalists to say that Black people are living longer, but on what basis? And so the article, so as I read the article and I read it with her, it was a great pedagogical exercise. We got more and more frustrated because the entire premise of the article was based on the following objective. Quote, the study was conducted to determine whether longer lifespans in African Americans with ALS compared to white non-Hispanics are secondary to higher rates of tracheostomies and invasive ventilation in African Americans. End quote. So here's the issue. And I feel like there's one doctor in the room, and if there's another, please speak up that can vouch for this. But if you trach somebody, if someone gets a tracheostomy, they are going to live longer in theory because that individual is no longer breathing on their own. There's now a technology and a device that's breathing for them, which is why they are now living longer. The more important question for me became, do individuals want a trach? And why are African Americans getting trached at a higher rate than white people, or as the study erroneously called the group, Caucasians? We can talk about that during Q&A. But what my participants showed me is similar to the story I just explained to you about Mr. Beck, who went in for constipation, is that there is either a bias happening with the doctor who's not understanding, or Black people were going in for these respiratory emergencies. And because they weren't able to breathe, they were getting tracheostomies because doctors don't have time to look through their record and say, oh, you have ALS. They're like, here's a patient in front of me. You can't breathe. I need to give you a tracheostomy. So for me, the problem that the study should have presented instead is that African Americans are receiving invasive ventilation more prevalently than white patients because African Americans are not getting access to non-invasive ventilation options like CPAPs or BiPAPs sooner in their illness progression. In response to a headline, a leading ALS physician at Wake Forest Baptist University said, quote, although we couldn't pinpoint why African Americans had more tracheostomies in our study, we do know that earlier interventions such as breathing masks can slow down the rate of decline and help patients deal with the disease. It gets worse before it gets better. After working with a statistician, because I didn't trust my own epi brain, we read through the statistical modeling done, and the entire study's premise was based off of one Black person. And thus, actually, when you break that sample down, because only one of the Black people had received the tracheostomy, it was not only not statistically significant, it was also based off of a illogical premise to begin with. These subsequent headlines that we then see here are not only just dangerous because they tell people that they should get a tracheostomy and that's going to help them live longer, but it's also the consequence of bad research. So one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Ruha Benjamin, whose book I showed earlier, is that oftentimes when we're having these conversations about race, which are super uncomfortable and we don't always know what to say, we always kind of slip into a space of colorblindness. Well, let's just remove race altogether. And then if we're a colorblind society, we don't have to think about it. Well, the reality is, as Dr. Benjamin says here, quote, race neutrality also turns out to be a deadly force. Race really matters, and particularly race really matters when thinking about how particular groups are being treated and what are the root causes, the structural determinants of health that really help us understand why individuals are receiving more adequate or inadequate care. So I leave you with kind of the following considerations. One, we have to be really mindful about improving our diagnostic schemas and awareness at the local level. So we have to kind of remove this idea and racialization of who is our norm of an ALS patient and actually broaden that a lot more. But that work not only happens from the clinical care, right, of just improving diagnostic schemes, it's also up to public health to support how do we think about who we're saying lives with that disease? How are we using certain data sets to come up with our data to say, oh, this is the prevalence, this is the incidence rate of a particular disease, and how are those data sets that we are utilizing, how are they skewed? How are they not telling the whole story, and how can we tell that whole story? We also need to be really thoughtful about removing race-based thinking, sorry for that small typo there, in science and public health. So what that means is that A, removing this idea that we need to move to race neutrality thinking, but also make sure that we're thinking about race as these cultural phenomena that shape different groups, but that we're not then diagnosing based on race. I can't tell you how many individuals in my book project who have said, oh, the doctor said I couldn't have ALS because I was Black. What? Race is not biological. And so if race is inherently not biological, how are we making diagnostics based on an individual's purported race? We can also get into conversations about genetics if you want as well. And finally, we have to make ALS a livable disease. One of the big challenges with ALS as a rare disease is that we do not have any valid treatments that extend life longer than 2.5 months at this point. We also don't have any quality control measures to make sure that care is being disseminated across all different clinics in the same way. And so what happens is that we have stories like I started with Uncle Tommy, where individuals are not being diagnosed with ALS until they go in for an emergency room event, where ALS is very much a disease that if your primary care doctor is paying attention, if they then know the correct referral structure to then send you to a neurologist, it actually is a disease that can be diagnosed within 3 to 4 months, and that's generously, and that's not based on your race, your gender, that is just doing good care. So we have to be thinking about if we want ALS to be livable, we have to be making sure that we're investing in these systems of care. Finally, because I always like to just show pictures of Black ALS patients to remind people that they are here and they are also fighting and resisting these different structures that make it very difficult to actually show up in epidemiological data. But I also think by bringing this project to my hometown of St. Louis, I like to always ground and end with a poem by poet, warrior, phenomenon. I'm obsessed with her, Audre Lorde, who wrote this beautiful poem called A Visit to a City Out of Time. And I invite somebody in the room here that is bold and brave to read it for us to end us out. I'll also call on you because I'm still a professor. Yes.
I can do it.
Thank you so much. What's your name?
I'm Hannah.
Hannah, thank you for being the brave
I'm
one.
sure I'll mess up the timing, but.
No, it's a poem. It's
If St. Louis took its rhythms from the river that cuts through it, the pulse of the Mississippi has torn this city apart. If St. Louis is somebody's home and not answering was nobody shoveling snow because spring would come one day. In time, people who live by rivers dream they are immortal.
beautiful. Thank you, Hannah. Here is to hoping that we are not out of time and that the stories of the individuals that I have been honored to be able to capture can not only impact medicine, science, and public health, but also can live on and be immortal. Thank you so much.
Right, so we have We have to use the microphone. We have to use the microphone or else our Zoom participants won't be able to hear us. So Chelsey, thank you very much. It was very inspiring. Are you discouraged or encouraged by what you see with ALS research right now as a scholar in this field? And what gives you hope for the future?
Great question. I am both. Can I be both? I'm both inspired and also not inspired. I think to start with the negative, I think I'm not inspired because of just like the political climate of the US right now, beyond just kind of the politics of upcoming election. We just now are seeing states quite literally say that a lot of the research that I do that gets dubbed as either DEI or diversity science are things that are not empirical and that are not really rigorous ways to approach this issue. And so it is scary when you see certain things happen kind of within our country where people are quite literally saying they don't value certain perspectives and they don't want to research health equity anymore. And so I think that is a little dystopic, but I think on the flip side, you see at like a very groundswell level, a lot of organizations being more thoughtful. And so I'm encouraged because I'm on the National Academies of Science study of ALS. And so we're working on the big report that's going to go to Congress. And given my hat in the ALS space, I've been really kind of adamant about the ways that we are thinking about these issues of equity and making sure that we have better surveillance projects to actually be able to quantify who's impacted, and then also supporting initiatives to actually support people once they're diagnosed at a research, clinical, and a care level, particularly for caregivers who bear a brunt of this disease and often are just ignored in the entire ALS ecosystem.
Well put. Let's take some questions from the audience and we can alternate back and forth with the chat. Here, let's start with Dr.
I'll also check the chat.
Thanks so much for that fantastic presentation of the passion in these presentations. I'm just curious, are there any examples where in the US they've done things right for Black people, like in terms of healthcare? Are there any like sort of take some example that you can take and be like, you know, you did a really great job. Why can't we use the same approach for other illnesses?
What a great question. I'm sure that on an individual level, there are people who are having positive experiences. So I first want to say that. But I'm thinking like across like large disease groups, the only thing that's actually speaking to me right now, and it's kind of it wasn't good at first, but now it's getting better, is seeing the work that's happening with sickle cell, which isn't necessarily a Black disease, of course, because no diseases are racialized, but because of the genetic impact of ALS, of sickle cell, it does have a higher percentage of people that are either from Mediterranean countries and or sub-Saharan Africa. And so what we've seen recently is that we now have our first ever sickle cell cure, where we knew the gene for sickle cell almost 20 years ago, and there was no kind of gene therapy work that went into improving that illness. Improving that condition. Now we actually have a cure, albeit a very complicated cure that involves like a full bone marrow transplant and all of this other stuff, but it is a cure, and it's now also FDA approved. So our big governing body that can say, okay, this is actually a therapy that can be pushed out, has said that it is possible. But I do think the kind of root of your question is that it is because of kind of what I was sharing earlier about the baked in aspects of systemic racism. It's really difficult in a country that has built everything on Indigenous genocide and Black labor to kind of say that they've ever done good things for health, because unfortunately the whole system has always never been to support people that it subjugated, because the people that it subjugated were a part of kind of the political economy of the excess of the country. So I think we're starting to see in smaller diseases this kind of improvement in care, but I think we still have a lot of work to do to kind of eliminate the ways that these kind of racist structures show up in medicine, healthcare, and public health.
Just a follow-up question.
Sure.
So whose role is it? Is it epidemiologists? Is it public health? Is it individual physicians? Or is this really a political question and it's the politicians that have to answer?
Yeah, I think it's all of us. I think because of how we've decided to silo the world, like I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm an anthropologist and a public health person. So I can't do the numbers like an epidemiologist can. I'm also not a physician, so I can't care and treat people, but I know that the ways in which improving how a physician cares and treats people can have a large impact. So I think it, like, not to kind of like simplify your question, but I really do think that it's all of us. But I also do think that it really does require a different investment top down from our government and how it's really thinking about healthcare access and how it's also thinking about supporting diseases for people that have been from these historically marginalized communities. And unfortunately, I think in the US, because of our political apparatus, that reads either as kind of a conservative logic of we're not putting any more funding into that because those people should do what they need to do. And then I think on the liberal side, it's like, well, we could add some funding, but I don't know if we have enough. And so it kind of, so I think that's why I speak to it's everyone. And I think that's why I really like the language of a lot of movement leaders who are thinking about either emergent strategy or ground swelling and understanding that like this might start at a local level of kind of affecting change, but we all have to be a part of it. It can't just be one person's responsibility or one group's responsibility. Thank you.
Is there a chat question?
I have a question actually online from Chelsey R. If you want to unmute yourself, Chelsey.
Hi there. Thank you for coming in. Your speech was really insightful. As for my question, I guess it'd be saying in the time since you've done your research, have you seen like direct changes or changes in perspective that's come from it?
Yeah, sure. I think that there is significantly more of a conversation around health equity in the ALS space. And so I sit on a lot of like committees and things with like people either at large ALS organizations in the US or large, like I mentioned, the National Academies of Science. And I would say when I started doing this research formally, or even when I was involved back in 2008, when I was a kid, there was no conversation about race and ALS. Like no one was thinking about socio-demographic factors. It was just like, we've got to find a cure, we've got to find a treatment. That's all that matters. And I think what we've seen is the ramification of that kind of siloing view of that's all that matters. And so we still don't have a cure, but now we have this kind of overproduction and over assumption that this disease only impacts white men. And so what we do now have are at least actors and players in the ALS space at the nonprofit level, and I would argue at kind of these large corporate organization levels that are thinking really thoughtfully about how do we do our research better? How do we make sure that we're not using race-based science in our research, but how are we also thinking a lot more thoughtfully about inclusion? Because I think I was just having this conversation the other day, so I'm just going to share it, is this belief that people with ALS should just find the ALS clinics. Okay, well, that's not going to happen. So how do we make it more accessible to them? And so thinking about using federally qualified health centers, making sure we're doing like an awareness drive with primary care physicians to support them. So thinking about like more local level initiatives. And those were ideas because I think the size of the population and the lack of like care by some providers to really think about kind of this granular level of like, if we are at least talking about it and acknowledging that there's a problem, now we can at least have a conversation about what do we do about the problem. Thank you for the question. I hope that answers your question.
That does. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi, so I have a question. I'm very new to ethnography. I was wondering if you could explain kind of the unique insight that you got from ethnography and why you kind of picked that approach for your research topic.
Yeah.
And also the 150 interviews, because we're teaching qualitative methods, and I've been stressing upon the students that that would be a mountain of data.
Yeah, I haven't even gotten through all 150 of interviews. So like most of my findings are off of like, I would say like just the patient and caregiver interviews. I haven't even gone through all of the, yeah. Brad's right. Listen to Brad. But I guess my response to your question is, if I had not used ethnography, and I think I believe this very strongly, I would not have found most of the Black people that I interviewed. So it became kind of a I want to say a rumor mill, that's not the accurate science language, but like, it was a snowball sample of quite literally, I started at clinics and I'm like, okay, where are the Black people with ALS? They're not showing up here, okay, so I'm gonna have to try somewhere else. And so then I went to the federally qualified health centers and I was like, can I observe like, you know, your neurological unit? And they were like, sure. Found a couple more there. Then in talking to other people, they're like, oh, I found out so-and-so has ALS. Oh, can you tell them I'm interested in talking to them? I also had quite a few posthumous interviews, I say. So like, for example, the story I start with Uncle Tommy. I never met Uncle Tommy. I never had that honor, but that was because of my friend Derek knew that I was working on this project, heard that somebody had ALS and is like, you need to talk to Chelsey. And so there's ways in which like I was connected with people in this project, particularly Black people, that I couldn't just find them, like kind of to my last question, at the clinics. And I couldn't just find them in the epi data too, right? But I knew that they existed because of my volunteer experiences in high school and college told me that Black people are around and they have ALS. Why are they not showing up at clinics? And so the ethnographic approach really helped me kind of uncover the problem in a different way that I don't think that a quantitative approach definitely wouldn't have elicited. But I think that the quantitative approaches really inform a lot of my work so I can start saying, oh, here's where some problems are, here are where some problems are. But this is like kind of gives us a lot more of the root cause explanation of why we're seeing some of these things quantitatively.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
That was a superb answer, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was like very curious about how you kind of recruited people, especially when you're following these people. And I was kind of curious about how you kind of navigate that and how people felt comfortable and just the whole kind of following people and how that kind of unfolded.
Absolutely, that's a fantastic question. So one of the things you find quickly in ethnography is that everyone doesn't want to be followed the way the book told you that when I read this method section, I'm going to follow them. Most people don't actually want that. And so it really is about the relationships you build with people. And I'll say that a lot of people I think I initially got to know well because I was in the clinic space. And so after I met them either met them at a clinic space or met them out of the clinic space and then came to a clinic appointment with me, I kind of served in, I'm not sure if these are common roles here in Canada, but like a community health worker role. So I kind of was like, because of all of my knowledge in ALS, I can also kind of explain things. So I can say, oh, well, this is what baclofen does. And when the doctor leaves, do you understand what they were saying? Oh, no, we have no idea. Okay, let me explain that back to you. So like we're building relationship because of I'm a familiar face because I'm a Black person and this whole entire like healthcare system is scary in some ways to some individuals. So I can kind of serve in this like quasi CHW role, but I also am building these relationships over time. So ethnography is not something you can just kind of drop in and then kind of come out. So I spent like even in my notes when I say that I spent 2 years, I actually probably spent 4 years in data collection. And there were people that I was able to follow all the way through. There are people whose funerals I've been to. There are people who, like Mr. Beck I just shared about with the constipation, I still go visit him in the nursing home. So there's people that like you're building relationships over time, but there's also people who I absolutely like did like 3 interviews with and they were like, we're good, thanks so much. So like it's you find the relationships that for different people at different times. And I think it's really all about like some of the soft characteristics that can't really be taught, like do you have empathy? Do you care? Like people are going to be much more inclined to have conversations and be in community with somebody who just simply cares. And so I try before kind of putting on my researcher hat, like I'm collecting data from you, like just to kind of be there. And so one of the kind of, what's the word? I'm blanking right now, but reciprocity, the gift. I tried to have a lot of reciprocity. So the individual in my last slide, his wife and I got very close. And so when I would come every week before we would do an interview, I would like clean whatever she needed because she's already taking care of him. So I would clean a bathroom or mop the floors. Like, so she knew that like, hey, I'm showing up for you as much as you're supporting my like elite academic dreams. Like I want you to know I'm a part of this with you and that like, I'm not just extracting from you. So that was something that I also did.
I'm glad you talked about the relationships over time, and we don't want to go over time.
Yes.
Because we've got, this room is booked at 1:30, so maybe one more question if there is one.
An easy one.
Anybody else? Yeah,
Softball question.
Okay, let me get to.
I don't know. Quick one.
Yeah, I know.
I was
Of course it is.
interested in your perspectives on kind of the intersection with critical disability studies and your work
Yeah.
here, because obviously this is intersectional, and there's a lot wrapped into the experience of disability in a country where there is not support for people with disability. And those are things that we experience here in Canada as well. It's a big problem. There's a lot less social support than maybe direct medical support. And so we see a lot of issues around ableism.
Absolutely, fantastic question. So I have a new section of one of my book chapters that's getting into critical disability studies, because one of the things that I think was the most hard was one of the hard things for a lot of people was becoming disabled, right? Like these weren't people that already had like lifelong disability, but to have to reshift into to kind of remold their identities into this role. But then also with disability studies hasn't always helped me get all the way with is not only they become disabled, then they die. Right? So what's it like to have to then make all these changes, go from a cane to a walker, to a manual wheelchair, to a power wheelchair, and then make sense of that, but also know that as you're getting closer to that, you're also about to pass away because of the progression of the disease. And so that then becomes like an interesting intersection, I would say, between like critical race theory, critical disability studies, and stigma that I've been really trying to kind of think about is like, how do we support people who are having to become disabled? So a lot of the really good critical disability work is like, oh, you've had a stroke. Oh, something's happened. You've had an acute event that reshapes your life, but you can still live on. But now we've had people that have to reshape their lives and they're not going to probably live on. And so that's been a place that I've been dancing in and also need to like read a lot more.
Excellent work.
I'm afraid that's gonna have to be the last word. Let's give another big round of applause. And that actually closes out our Public Health Sciences Seminar series for this year. I want to thank everyone that attended today. It's been fantastic, both in person and online. And I hope you were energized by the work that Dr. Carter's doing. I'm very proud of her and very excited for the future, and also optimistic. I hope that we, don't have to pour ice water over people's heads to get them to pay attention to this important topic. But thanks, everybody, and good luck with the rest of the term, and we'll see you soon.